The story of the Morgan family was well known in the small town of Willow Creek. Clara Morgan, a widow, had raised her son David alone after her husband disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some whispered that he'd abandoned them. Others believed he was dead. Whatever the truth, Clara rarely spoke of him, and when she passed away suddenly one winter evening, she left behind a son burdened by unanswered questions. David had left Willow Creek shortly after his mother's death. Though the house remained in his name, he could never bring himself to return. It was as though the walls of the farmhouse held secrets he wasn't ready to face until fate brought an unexpected visitor. But it wasn't always like this. The Morgan family once lived a life of modest happiness in their humble farmhouse on the outskirts of Willow Creek. Samuel Morgan was a carpenter known for his strong hands and gentle heart. While Clara filled the home with warmth, her laughter ringing like a melody, their son David, a bright-eyed boy of 8, was the center of their world. The Morgans' bond was the envy of many in the small town. Weekends were spent under the sprawling oak tree behind their barn, with Samuel whittling small toys for David while Clara read stories aloud. Each evening the family shared simple meals around a creaky wooden table, their conversations bubbling with joy. But happiness, as it often does, proved fleeting. One rainy evening Samuel burst into the house, his face pale and his hands trembling. He hugged Clara tightly, whispering words David couldn't understand. The boy only remembered his father kneeling before him, placing both hands on his shoulders. "David, no matter what happens, remember that I love you," Samuel said, his voice heavy with emotion. By morning, Samuel was gone. The townsfolk speculated wildly. Some claimed Samuel had stolen money from a local contractor. Others whispered that he had killed a man in a drunken brawl. As days turned into weeks, the accusations grew darker. Some even insinuated that Samuel had cheated on Clara and abandoned his family for another woman. David, too young to grasp the complexities of adult choices, absorbed the gossip like a sponge. His father's absence became a source of resentment, and soon that resentment extended to Clara. But only Clara knew what had happened to Samuel. Samuel had taken on a new client for his carpentry business, a wealthy contractor named Vincent Crowley, who was funding the construction of a lavish estate just outside of town. The job promised to pay more than Samuel had ever earned, enough to secure David's future and help Clara realize her dream of transforming their farmland. But Crowley was not the honest businessman he appeared to be. At first, the job seemed like a dream come true. Vincent Crowley was a well-dressed, silver-tongued contractor who spoke in grand terms about the estate he wanted to build. It wasn't just any project, it was a sprawling mansion that would be the crown jewel of Willow Creek. For Samuel Morgan, it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. The pay was generous, and Crowley promised more work to follow if the job was completed to his satisfaction. But as Samuel worked on the project, he began noticing oddities. Deliveries of expensive materials would arrive late, yet Crowley never seemed concerned. Workers on site often spoke in hushed tones, avoiding Samuel's questions about the delays. Payments to subcontractors were erratic, sometimes disappearing entirely without explanation. One evening, as Samuel stayed late to finish installing custom cabinetry in the main hall, he stumbled upon a leather-bound ledger left on a table in Crowley's temporary office. The book was open, revealing columns of figures that didn't add up. At first, Samuel thought it was a simple mistake, but as he flipped through the pages, his unease grew. The numbers painted a chilling picture. Funds for the estate were being funneled through multiple shell companies, all with ties to names Samuel recognized from news reports about organized crime. Payments far exceeding the cost of construction were being laundered through the project, with each entry meticulously recorded. His hands trembled as he closed the book. Samuel knew he shouldn't have seen it, but it was too late. The door creaked open, and Crowley stepped inside, his face an unreadable mask. "You're still here, Morgan?" Crowley's tone was casual, but there was a sharpness in his eyes as he glanced at the ledger. "Yeah," Samuel replied, trying to keep his voice steady, just finishing up for the day. Crowley stepped closer, his gaze lingering on the book before he slowly closed it. "You've been doing good work here. Shame if something interrupted it." Samuel forced a nod and left the office, his heart pounding. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning he returned to work as if nothing had happened, but the tension in the air was palpable. Crowley's men watched him closely, their eyes following his every move. Samuel tried to push the discovery out of his mind, but the weight of it gnawed at him. He confided in Clara one evening, his voice low as he explained what what he'd found. "It's bad, Clara," he said, pacing the kitchen. "The kind of bad you don't come back from. If I go to the police, they'll know it was me. If I stay quiet, I'm complicit. Either way, we're in danger." Clara, always the calm voice of reason, tried to reassure him. "Maybe it's not as bad as it seems. Just keep your head down and finish the job. Don't give them a reason to look at you." But it was too late. A few days later, Crowley summoned Samuel to his office. When he arrived, he found two men in dark suits waiting with Crowley, their faces devoid of warmth. "Mr. Morgan," Crowley said, leaning back in his chair, "we've got a problem." Samuel felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of problem?" Crowley slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of forged invoices and bank statements implicating Samuel in the theft of nearly $100,000 from the project's funds. "You've been skimming, Morgan," Crowley said, his tone icy, "and my clients aren't happy about it." Samuel's mouth went dry. "I didn't take anything, you know that." Crowley's smile was thin and cruel. "Doesn't matter what I know. What matters is what they think, and they think you owe them." The men behind Crowley stepped forward, their presence a silent threat. "Here's how this works," Crowley continued. "You disappear, and we make this problem go away, or you stick around and your family becomes the problem." Samuel's mind raced as he left the meeting. He knew he couldn't stay in Willow Creek, not with Crowley's men watching his every move. But leaving meant abandoning everything, his wife, his son, the life they had built together. That night, he made the hardest decision of his life. The morning after Samuel's disappearance, the town buzzed with rumors. Crowley wasted no time spreading his version of events, painting Samuel as a thief who had stolen from the project and fled to avoid prosecution. With no way to prove otherwise, Clara was left to face the whispers and the stares alone. David, only 8 years old, struggled to understand. "Why did Dad leave?" he asked Clara, his voice small and confused. "Did he do something bad?" Clara's heart broke as she tried to shield him from the truth. "Your father loves you," she said. "He didn't leave because he wanted to." But David, too young to grasp the complexities of betrayal and sacrifice, began to believe the rumors. Over time, his confusion turned to anger, and his once close relationship with Clara became strained. Clara was left to navigate a world that had turned cold and unforgiving. The whispers in town about her husband's alleged crimes followed her everywhere. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided eye contact, and her once thriving social circle shrank to nothing. To protect David, she tried to ignore the rumors, but they cut deeply, especially when she saw their impact on her son. Money was tight. Samuel's carpentry business had been their main source of income, and without it, Clara had to find work wherever she could. She began sewing for wealthier families in town, fixing torn hems and embroidering tablecloths late into the night. She also cleaned houses and occasionally took in laundry, her hands red and raw from scrubbing. Despite her efforts, the mortgage on the farmhouse loomed over them. She sold whatever she could spare, old furniture, Samuel's tools, even her wedding ring, to make ends meet. The garden became their lifeline, providing vegetables to eat and sometimes trade. Clara often went hungry to make sure David had enough. Though she kept a brave face for her son, the strain was undeniable. She'd often retreat to her bedroom, where she cried quietly, clutching an old photograph of her family under the oak tree. In her heart, she still held hope that Samuel would return, though the silence stretched into years. As David grew older, his confusion about his father's disappearance turned to anger. The whispers in town were hard to ignore, especially when his classmates echoed them. "Your dad's a thief," one boy sneered at him during recess. "My uncle said he stole a bunch of money and ran away." Another added, "Bet he's not coming back because he doesn't care about you." David threw punches, earning himself a reputation for being short-tempered and volatile. Each time, Clara would sit him down and try to soothe him. "David," she'd say softly, "your father loved you. Whatever people say, that doesn't change the truth." "Then why did he leave us?" David would shout back. "Why did he leave me?" Clara had no answer. Telling him the truth about Samuel's departure and the dangers they faced would only add to his burden. Instead, she repeated the same reassurances, though they rang hollow even to her own ears. By the time David reached his teenage years, the bond he once shared with Clara was frayed. He avoided her as much as possible, spending hours wandering the woods or sitting under the oak tree where his father used to carve toys. The farmhouse, once filled with warmth and laughter, became a place of tense silence. Clara, exhausted from working long hours and managing the farm, struggled to connect with her son. She noticed how he withdrew further with each passing year, but every attempt to bridge the gap was met with anger. "You always defend him," David snapped one one evening after Clara asked why he'd skipped school. "You act like he was some great man, but he wasn't. He was a coward who ran away and left us to clean up his mess." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned back to the kitchen sink, scrubbing furiously to hide her pain. She knew David's anger wasn't truly aimed at her, but it still hurt. In her diary, she wrote, "David is slipping away from me. Each day he looks more like Samuel, but his heart is hardened by anger. How do I reach him? How do I help him understand?" There were fleeting moments when the old warmth between Clara and David resurfaced. On David's 14th birthday, Clara baked him a small cake, using what little she could spare. As they sat together at the table, the flickering candlelight softened the distance between them. "I'm sorry it's not much," Clara said, pushing the plate toward him. David hesitated before taking a bite. "It's good," he muttered, his tone grudging but sincere. Clara smiled, though her heart ached for the boy who used to light up at the smallest gesture. She wished she could explain the sacrifices she had made to keep them afloat, but she feared he would see them as failures instead of acts of love. Clara lived in constant fear of the men who had threatened Samuel. Though they hadn't shown up at the farmhouse in the years since Samuel's departure, Clara often felt eyes watching her. She kept the doors and windows locked even during the day and always looked over her shoulder when walking into town. Her diary became her confidant, the only place where she could express her fears. She wrote of strange cars parked near the edge of their property, men asking questions about Samuel in town, and the weight of carrying Samuel's secret alone. One entry read, "They haven't come yet, but I know they will. I see their shadows in my dreams. If anything happens to me, I pray David will forgive me for not telling him everything." When Clara was found dead in her bedroom one winter morning, the official report said it was a heart attack, but there were details that didn't add up. The lock on the front door was broken, and a neighbor reported hearing raised voices the night before. David, now 16, was devastated. Though he and Clara had been distant in recent years, her death left a gaping void. Adding to his grief was a nagging sense of guilt for the years he'd spent resenting her. After the funeral, David couldn't bear to stay in the farmhouse. It felt like the walls were closing in on him, each room filled with ghosts of the life they'd lost. Packing a small bag, he left Willow Creek, vowing to never return. David carried the weight of his unresolved feelings. In the city, he built a new life, working odd jobs and avoiding any mention of his family, but the questions about his parents lingered in the back of his mind. Why had his father left? What had really happened to his mother, and why did it feel like their lives had been ripped apart by forces beyond their control? He hated himself for the bitterness he had shown Clara, wishing he could go back and tell her he loved her. 20 years later, David Morgan had carved out a life of success in the bustling heart of the city. Now in his late 30s, he was no longer the lost, angry teenager who had fled the small town of Willow Creek with a battered suitcase and a head full of unanswered questions. Over the years, through sheer determination, he had risen to prominence in the corporate world, becoming a respected figure in property development. With tailored suits, a sharp mind, and an unwavering work ethic, David had built an empire from the ground up, but for all his achievements, he was a man haunted by the ghosts of his past. David's life was meticulously controlled. He avoided personal attachments, finding solace in the unrelenting demands of his career. The corporate world suited him. It was transactional, efficient, and offered none of the messy complications of family or emotions. To his colleagues, he was a man of mystery, someone who commanded respect but rarely shared personal details. Few dared to ask about his family or where he came from. Though outwardly composed, David's nights were often restless. His dreams were filled with fragmented memories: his father's voice, his mother's hands working the soil in their small garden, the warm light of the farmhouse kitchen before it all went dark. In his more vulnerable moments, he would sit by the window of his high-rise apartment, staring out at the city lights and wondering if success had been worth the price he paid. David had become powerful and wealthy. He donated generously to charities, particularly those that supported single mothers and underprivileged children, though he never explained why. His assistant once commented on his choice to avoid flashy cars and extravagant displays of wealth, to which he'd replied simply, "I know what it's like to have nothing." But his wealth couldn't buy peace of mind. The bitterness he had shown toward Clara during his teenage years haunted him. He often replayed their arguments in his mind, wishing he could rewrite the past. The image of her her standing in the kitchen, her shoulders stooped with the weight of her struggles, was one he couldn't escape. On nights when the guilt was too much, he would open a small wooden box he kept hidden in his desk. Inside was a photograph of Clara, Samuel, and himself as a child, taken under the oak tree. It was the only piece of his past he had allowed himself to keep. It was on one such restless evening, as David sat at his desk, staring at the photograph, that his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, and he almost ignored it, assuming it was another business call. But something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" he said, his voice edged with impatience. "David?" The voice on the other end was soft, hesitant. "This is Abigail Ross. I was a friend of your mother's." David's grip on the phone tightened at the mention of Clara. He hadn't heard her name spoken aloud in years. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone wary. "I need to talk to you," Abigail said. "It's about your parents, and I found something. A letter from Clara. For you." For a moment, David didn't speak. He felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, the walls of his carefully constructed life suddenly less stable. "A letter?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Abigail said gently. "There are things you need to know, David, things Clara wanted you to understand." David's mind raced. A part of him wanted to hang up, to slam the door on whatever Pandora's box Abigail was opening. But another part, the part that had carried the weight of his past for so long, whispered that this might be his only chance to finally find the answers he had been avoiding. "When can we meet?" he asked, his voice steady but his heart pounding. As Abigail gave him the details, David felt a mix of dread and anticipation. For years he had lived with the ghosts of his parents' choices, their love, their secrets, and their sacrifices. Now, for the first time, it felt like he was on the verge of uncovering the truth, and perhaps finding a way to finally let go of the pain he had carried for so long. But who was Abigail? A lifelong bond. Abigail Ross and Clara Morgan had been inseparable since they were children. Growing up in Willow Creek, the two girls spent countless hours exploring the woods, picking wildflowers, and dreaming about the lives they would one day lead. Clara was the creative one, full of big ideas and endless optimism, while Abigail, practical and observant, was her steadying anchor. Together, they balanced each other perfectly. When Clara met Samuel, Abigail was the first to hear all about the carpenter with kind eyes and a quick wit. She was Clara's maid of honor at the wedding, holding her bouquet as she promised a life of love and devotion to Samuel. Abigail also became David's godmother, a role she cherished, though life's twists and turns later kept her from being as present as she wanted. Even as adults, their bond remained strong. Abigail was there to celebrate Clara's joys, like the birth of David and the early days of their marriage, when the farmhouse was filled with laughter. But she was also there during the darker times, when Samuel began working longer hours to make ends meet, and when Clara confided that she worried about the toll it was taking on their family. When Samuel fled, Clara turned to Abigail in desperation. Late one evening, Abigail arrived at the farmhouse to find Clara pacing the kitchen, her face pale and her hands trembling. She poured out everything: Samuel's discovery about the crime syndicate, the threats they had received, and his decision to leave to protect them. "I don't know what to do, Abby," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "He said it was the only way to keep us safe, but how do I explain this to David? How do I keep him safe if they come looking for Samuel?" Abigail tried to comfort her, but the weight of the situation was overwhelming. She urged Clara to go to the authorities, but Clara refused. "They won't help us," Clara said, "and if I go to them, David will be caught in the middle. I can't risk that." Abigail promised to keep Clara's secret, but the knowledge haunted her. Over the years, she saw the strain it placed on her friend, the sleepless nights, the endless work to provide for David, and the quiet fear that never left her eyes. When Abigail received the news of Clara's death, she was devastated. She traveled to Willow Creek for the funeral, but the circumstances surrounding her friend's passing left her unsettled. Though the official report listed the cause of death as a heart attack, Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. She was too strong for this to be natural, Abigail told a mutual friend after the service. Something doesn't add up. But with David leaving town and the farmhouse falling waylent, there was little Abigail could do. For years, she wrestled with her guilt, feeling as though she had failed Clara by not uncovering the truth. She returned to the farmhouse sporadically, hoping to find some clue that might explain what had really happened. Each visit felt like stepping into a time capsule, the rooms frozen in the moments before Clara's world fell apart. As the years passed, Abigail couldn't ignore the pull of the farmhouse. Though she had her own life in a nearby town, with her retirement giving her more time for reflection, her thoughts often wandered back to Clara and the promise she had made to protect her friend's legacy. One day, while catching up with an old acquaintance from Willow Creek, Abigail learned that the farmhouse still belonged to the Morgan family. It had remained untouched since David left, its once thriving garden now overgrown and its walls beginning to crumble from neglect. "It's like time stopped there," the acquaintance said. "No one stepped foot in it since Clara passed." Hearing this, Abigail felt a pang of sorrow and an inexplicable urgency. She had always felt there were unanswered questions surrounding Clara's life and death, and now, with the house untouched, it felt like fate was giving her one last chance to find the truth. The next morning, she packed a small bag and drove to Willow Creek. As she pulled up the long, overgrown driveway, her heart clenched at the sight of the house. It looked smaller than she remembered, its shutters hanging crookedly and ivy climbing the stone walls. But as she stepped onto the porch and opened the creaking front door, she felt Clara's presence as strongly as if her friend were standing beside her. "I'm here, Clara," Abigail whispered. "I'm going to figure this out. I owe you that much." As Abigail moved through the house, memories of Clara flooded back. The two of them baking cookies in the kitchen, laughing as flour dusted their hair, or sitting by the fire, sharing secrets late into the night. But beneath the nostalgia was a lingering unease. The silence of the house felt oppressive, as if it were holding on to the pain and fear that had filled Clara's final days. In the parlor, she paused, her gaze falling on the fireplace mantel where a faded photograph rested. It was of Clara, Samuel, and young David, their faces alight with joy. Abigail reached out, brushing her fingers across the glass as a wave of bittersweet memories washed over her. As she turned to leave, her foot caught on the edge of an old rug. She bent down to straighten it, her hands brushing against the floorboards beneath. That was when she noticed it. One of the boards was slightly raised, its edges uneven. Abigail's heart quickened as curiosity took hold. She hesitated, glancing around the room as if expecting Clara herself to stop her. Kneeling down, she pried the loose board free, revealing a tin box nestled in the hollow space. Its edges were rusted, its surface weathered, but it was intact. When she opened it and saw Clara's handwriting on the envelope, her breath caught. "To my son David," it read. Abigail sat back on her heels, tears welling in her eyes. She could hear Clara's voice in her mind, soft and determined. "This is for David. He deserves to know the truth." At that moment, Abigail knew what she had to do. She would find David and give him the letter, and if the farmhouse held more secrets, she would uncover them too. Clara's story wasn't over, and Abigail was determined to see it through. The drive back to Willow Creek felt surreal to David. It had been over 2 decades since he had last seen the narrow roads winding through the familiar countryside, the golden fields stretching into the horizon, and the occasional clusters of small, aging homes that dotted the landscape. Though the town had remained largely unchanged, it felt foreign to him now, like a place from a dream he could barely recall. As he drove past the sign welcoming him to Willow Creek, memories came rushing back, and yet woven into those memories was the weight of his resentment. David tightened his grip on the steering wheel. This wasn't just a trip back to his hometown. It was a confrontation with the ghosts of his past. When David pulled into the town square, he noticed the way people paused to look at his car. Willow Creek was a small town, and new arrivals, or in David's case old ones, didn't go unnoticed. Some faces were vaguely familiar, though weathered by time. A few people seemed to recognize him, their eyes narrowing as they whispered to one another. "Isn't that David Morgan?" an elderly man muttered to his companion. "Haven't seen him since Clara's funeral." David avoided their gazes, stepping out of his car and walking briskly toward the small cafe where he was supposed to meet Abigail. The air felt heavy, as though the town itself remembered his family's pain and tragedy. Abigail was waiting for him at a table by the window, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. Though older now, her sharp hazel eyes were unmistakable, and they softened as she saw him approach. "David," she said warmly, standing to greet him. "Thank you for coming." He nodded stiffly, unsure of what to say. Sitting across from her, he felt a strange mix of unease and curiosity. Abigail had been a close friend of his mother's, yet she was practically a stranger to him. Abigail wasted no time. She reached into her bag and pulled out the yellowed envelope, sliding it across the table toward him. "This is the letter," she said quietly. "It's from Clara. She wrote it for you before she passed." David stared at the envelope, his name written in his mother's familiar handwriting. His chest tightened. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the paper. For a moment he didn't move, as though the weight of the letter might crush him. "Why now?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. "Why did it take so long to find this?" "I didn't know it existed until a few weeks ago," she said, "but I knew I had to bring it to you. Clara wanted you to have it." David drove out to the old farmhouse alone. As the structure came into view, he felt a pang of emotion he hadn't expected. Stepping out of the car, David hesitated at the front door. The last time he had walked through it, he had been a teenager full of anger and grief. Now, the silence of the house seemed almost deafening, as though it had been holding its breath, waiting for his return. Inside, dust coated every surface. The air was thick with the scent of age and neglect, but beneath it, David thought he could still detect a faint trace of lavender, his mother's favorite scent. His footsteps echoed as he moved through the rooms, each one stirring memories he had long tried to bury. He stopped in the kitchen, where his mother had spent so much of her time. The worn table was still there, the place where she had baked his birthday cake, where they had shared so many meals, and where they had fought bitterly in the years after his father left. Sitting on the edge of the kitchen table, he unfolded the yellowed paper with trembling hands. "My dearest David, if you're reading this, it means I am no longer there to explain the things I never had the courage to say. For that, I am deeply sorry. I know that our years together were not easy, and I know I made mistakes. You were angry with me, and I never blamed you for that. You deserved answers I couldn't give, and love that sometimes felt distant in the face of everything we endured. There's something you need to know about your father. He didn't leave us because he didn't love us. He left because he was trying to protect us. Samuel discovered something dangerous, something that put all of us at risk. He thought that by leaving he could keep us safe. I kept his secret because I thought it was the right thing to do, but now I wonder if it only hurt you more. The night he left, he held me close and made me promise one thing: to protect you, no matter the cost. I may not have done it perfectly, but every breath I took was for you. I need you to know this. We both loved you, more than words could ever capture. You were, and always will be, our greatest gift." David, his eyes blurred with tears, making it impossible to continue. Tears streamed down his face. The letter felt like a lifeline, pulling him back to a version of his mother he had almost forgotten. The mother who had loved him fiercely, even when he had pushed her away. The mother who had carried the weight of their family's struggles alone, never letting him see how deeply it hurt her. David sat in silence for a long time, the letter clutched in his hands. The answers he had sought for so many years were beginning to take shape, but they came with a crushing wave of guilt and grief. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to truly feel the depth of his loss. His eyes lingered on the final lines. "There's more to the story, David. If you're ready to learn the truth, go to the place Samuel left something for you." The place. Those words echoed in his mind. His father had often spoken in riddles, turning mundane moments into adventures for him as a boy. David leaned back in the chair, staring at the dust-speckled ceiling. He let the memories wash over him, the warm summer evenings, the sound of laughter drifting through the open windows, and the place where they had spent their happiest days. Then it struck him, the oak tree. The oak tree had been the center of their world. Towering and ancient, it stood behind the farmhouse, its roots curling into the earth like the fingers of time itself. It had been a place of joy and solace for the Morgan family, a place where Samuel had carved wooden toys for David, where Clara had spread out blankets for picnic, and where David had felt most secure. Now, standing in the backyard, David approached the oak tree slowly. The ground beneath him was uneven, the grass overgrown, but the tree was exactly as he remembered it, massive, weathered, and imposing. His fingers brushed against the rough bark as he circled the trunk, searching for some clue. He remembered his father's voice, low and playful, saying, "Some treasures are meant to be hidden, David. The fun is in the finding." Could his father have left something here all those years ago? David's eyes caught a faint mark on the trunk of the old old oak tree, a carved arrow, barely visible after years of weathering. David knelt at the base of the tree, his fingers trembling as they dug into the soil. The ground was firm, but gave way as he worked, and soon his hands struck something hard. Pulling the object free, he unearthed a small, rusted metal box. Heart-pounding, he carried it to the porch of the farmhouse and sat on the weathered step. With great care, he pried open the lock, the lid creaking as it gave way. Inside, beneath layers of faded fabric, were items that seemed ordinary at first. A cracked compass, an old photograph of Samuel and Clara, and something David didn't recognize, a single, carefully folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. But this wasn't a letter addressed to him. The handwriting was unmistakably Samuel, but the envelope was addressed to Clara. It had never been opened. David stared at it, the weight of its existence sinking in. His mother had kept this letter a secret, hiding it away as though its contents were too dangerous or too painful to reveal. He hesitated for a long moment before gently breaking the seal. The note was brief, hastily written, and smudged in places, as if it had been folded in a hurry. Clara, I don't have much time. Crowley's men are closing in. They know too much. Burn everything. My journals, the plans, the ledgers. Don't let them find you or David. Trust no one. There's more buried in the shop. Only use it if you have no other choice. I love you both. Samuel. David's heart raced as he turned the letter over in his hands. The shop, his father's old woodworking shed, had been locked and abandoned since Samuel's disappearance. It didn't take long for him to make his way there. The door groaned on its hinges as he pushed it open, dust and stale air greeting him. He flicked on the flashlight from his phone, scanning the room. The workbench stood as he remembered it, and Samuel's tools still hung neatly on their pegs. But David's eyes went to the floorboards. Several of them looked out of place, as though they'd been pried up and hastily replaced. Kneeling down, David worked to remove the loose boards, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was another box, this one sturdier than the first. It held a bundle of documents, all written in Samuel's precise handwriting, detailed notes about Vincent Crowley, the syndicate, and the illegal operations Samuel had uncovered. David's stomach turned as he read through the pages. There were names, dates, and figures, all the proof needed to expose Crowley's crimes. Samuel had meticulously recorded everything, even as he knew it put his life at risk. Alongside the notes was an old key tied to a small leather tag that read simply, Crowley Estate. David stared at the key, his mind racing. His father had left behind more than memories. He had left a trail leading straight to the heart of the danger that had torn their family apart. The estate was Crowley's infamous mansion, the project Samuel had worked on just before he disappeared. David had avoided thinking about it for years, but now it loomed large in his mind, a place tied to the unanswered questions that had haunted him. As David stood in the dim light of the shop, clutching the key and the notes, one thing became clear. The truth behind his family's suffering wasn't just buried in the past. It was waiting for him, locked away in the secrets Samuel had uncovered, and the enemies who had taken everything from them. This wasn't over. The key felt heavy in David's hand as he drove toward the Crowley estate, its weight mirrored in his chest. The documents Samuel had left were damning, detailed evidence of Crowley's money laundering, connections to organized crime, and even names of the people Crowley had ordered to intimidate and silence his enemies. But it wasn't just about the crimes anymore. Crowley and his syndicate had destroyed his family, taken his father, and left his mother to fend for herself against threats too dangerous to face alone. Now, after decades of hiding, the time for justice or revenge had come. The Crowley estate loomed on the edge of town, its sprawling grounds overgrown, and its once grand facade dulled by years of neglect. Crowley had vanished years ago, but David knew men like him didn't truly disappear. Somewhere in the shadows, he was still pulling strings, still thriving on the misery of others. David parked a short distance away, his heart pounding as he approached the gate. He used the key Samuel had left behind to unlock the rusted padlock, the click echoing in the cold night air. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, but the path to the main house was clear, as if someone had recently been through. Inside, the mansion mansion was eerily quiet, its grandeur faded but still imposing. David moved carefully, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He followed the instructions in Samuel's notes, looking for the room marked as Crowley's office. The office was just as Samuel had described, a large desk dominating the room, with walls lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets. David rifled through the cabinets, his pulse quickening as he found folders containing forged contracts, lists of payments to syndicate members, and blueprints for money laundering schemes. It was all there, the proof his father had tried to expose. But one item caught his eye, a black ledger, hidden in the false bottom of a drawer. Inside were names, clients, associates, and victims of Crowley's network. As David scanned the pages, one name stood out, sending a chill down his spine: Clara Morgan. Next to her name was a single word: neutralized. David's grip on the ledger tightened, rage bubbling to the surface. It was confirmation of what he had long suspected. Crowley's men had killed his mother just as they had threatened to do years earlier. His father had sacrificed everything to protect them, but the syndicate's reach had still found its way to Clara. David's years in the corporate world had given him access to power, resources, and connections. With the black ledger as his weapon, he began building a case against Crowley, leveraging his influence to expose the man piece by piece. First, he discreetly leaked portions of the ledger to law enforcement, just enough to put Crowley's name back in circulation and make him uneasy. Then he contacted key figures in Crowley's old network, dangling the prospect of immunity in exchange for information. Slowly, the walls began closing in on the once untouchable Vincent Crowley. Finally, David sent Crowley a direct message through an intermediary. It was short and simple. "You and I need to talk face to face. You know who I am and you know what I have. Meet me or the whole world will." Crowley agreed, though not without precautions. The meeting was set at an upscale private club in the city, a neutral ground where Crowley likely believed he held some control. David, however, had spent years mastering the art of negotiation and intimidation, and he knew how to seize control of the narrative before Crowley even walked through the door. When Crowley arrived, his once imposing demeanor was shadowed by unease. He found David already seated in a private room, calm and composed, with a briefcase resting beside him. "You've been busy," Crowley said, attempting to sound casual as he sat across from David, digging up old skeletons. David didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, studying the man who had been a specter in his life for so long. Finally, he opened the briefcase and slid the ledger across the table. "Recognize this?" David's voice was cold, calculated. Crowley's face tightened as he flipped through the pages, his facade cracking. "I don't know what you think you found, but—" "Save it," David interrupted. "I know everything. The money laundering, the crimes you covered up, the people you silenced, including my mother." Crowley's eyes flickered, betraying his panic. "Clara was collateral damage," he said, his voice defensive. "Your father got involved in things he shouldn't have. If anyone's to blame, it's him." David leaned forward, his calm exterior barely masking the rage simmering beneath. "You had a choice," he said. "You didn't just take his life, you destroyed hers. You ripped apart our family. And now I'm going to make sure you lose everything." David's plan unfolded with surgical precision. He had already positioned reporters and federal agents to act as soon as the meeting ended. Crowley had walked into a trap, and he didn't even realize it yet. "I've sent copies of this ledger to every major outlet in the country," David said, his voice steady. "Your crimes are about to be front-page news, but I wanted you to hear it from me first." Crowley's bravado crumbled as he realized the extent of David's reach. "You can't do this," he hissed. "Do you have any idea who you're messing with? There are people far more dangerous than me." David's lips curled into a faint, cold smile. "I've already taken care of them. Your network is gone. Your allies have turned. Your secrets are out, and you're nothing." As the weight of his words sank in, David stood and turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back. "One last thing. The name Clara Morgan, it'll be the one people remember. Yours will just be a footnote in the story of what you did to her." Within hours, Crowley's world imploded. News outlets ran exposés detailing decades of corruption, naming him as the mastermind behind a vast criminal enterprise. His assets were frozen, his allies abandoned him, and he was taken into custody by federal agents. The once powerful man was left disgraced and powerless, his empire crumbling under the weight of David's carefully executed revenge. Standing under the old oak tree back at the farmhouse, David held a copy of the article detailing Crowley's downfall. He looked up at the sprawling branches, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, and thought of his parents, their sacrifices, their love, and the strength they had passed on to him. "This is for you," he whispered, placing the article at the base of the tree. "For both of you." With his wealth and resources, David decided to honor his parents' sacrifices and turn the farmland into something meaningful, a community center dedicated to single mothers, struggling families, and children in need. He named it the Clara Morgan Center, a tribute to the woman who had given everything for her son. The farmhouse itself was restored to its former glory, its walls repainted and its roof repaired. The parlor became a gathering space where families could meet, laugh, and connect. The garden that had once fed his mother and him during hard times was replanted with fruits, vegetables, and flowers, now tended by volunteers and children learning about sustainability and growth. And as David watched the sun set over the fields, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Justice had been served, and his parents' legacy had been honored. The Morgan family story, once shrouded in pain, had found its rightful ending.